Hi, we're back, and I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Emily Grossman, who has a PhD in cancer research and has dedicated her career to science engagement. Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
And yeah, I just wanted to start off. You were actually not going to attend the conference in person, but Skype in regardless. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that decision.
Sure. So, I was expecting to be here via Skype or via internet connection in this way because when I was invited to take part in the conference, I thought, well, no, this is really wonderful and I'd love to be there. But I've actually decided not to fly for environmental reasons. And I'm actually part of quite a few campaigns to encourage more people to stop flying, unless for sort of emergency reasons or essential reasons, and also to encourage other conferences and events to Skype their speakers in, because it really is such an important thing now that we all take real responsibility for our own contribution to the climate and ecological emergency. So, a lot of people don't realize that one single return transatlantic flight, not that, of course, going from the UK to Copenhagen is transatlantic, but just to give you an example, a return transatlantic flight emits the same amount of carbon as 13 years worth of a family's electricity emissions, home electricity combined. And also another example to give is that flying from London to Rome, so that I guess is a slightly more equivalent distance, produces 4 times more carbon emissions than traveling that same route by car, 15 times more than traveling by national rail, and 100 times more than traveling by international rail. So, the Financial Times actually wrote an article recently, and the headline was, "The only way to hit net zero by 2050 is to stop flying." So I used to fly an awful lot for both personal reasons, but mostly for professional reasons. So I would give international talks across the globe. I would run training events for scientists to help them to communicate about their work. And I would be flown to amazing places. I've traveled to at least 20 or 30 different international countries in the last few years. But I've now categorically said, no, I'm not going to be flying. And I want to use my platform to raise awareness about the damage that this is doing to the environment. Now, of course, the most important thing we can all be doing, not right now, because obviously we're in a pandemic right now and there's a lot of other stuff going on, but even in parallel with this, the most important thing that we can be doing, because, even whilst this unfolds, there is going to be a temporary reduction in carbon emissions and a temporary respite, shall we say, for the environment. But we need to be really clear that when we kind of come out of this pandemic, we still need to be really focusing on the climate and ecological emergency. And this year is a really crucial year to start to bring our emissions down. And we need to be really clear that people need to take global responsibility by targeting governments and calling for structural and systemic change. And that's super important. But on a personal level, we can be doing our bit, and flying is a particularly important way that we can be doing that, as well as avoiding the meat and dairy industries, avoiding using cars as much as possible, and also looking at insulating our homes using green energy providers. And those are sort of the key ways that we can help. So I've now said that all of my work from now on, I will either travel by train or by ferry, or I will Skype in. Obviously, that is now completely grounded for the foreseeable future, and I now have no work for the foreseeable future because my work is all about giving talks at public events, which of course have all been cancelled. But seriously, that aside, when we do start to kind of hopefully come back from this, it's really important that we don't forget about the other major crisis on our planet, which actually arguably is going to have, well, not even arguably, is going to have far more lasting effect and impact far more people's lives in the long term than this pandemic.
Yeah, and this conference being virtual is such a good test to see if we can connect this way.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what's going on right now, is people are actually being forced to stay home, and we are actually really seeing some amazing changes where we are realizing that it is possible to go about, not for everyone, I'm not underplaying the devastating impact that it's having on a lot of people's livelihoods right now, and of course a lot of people's health, but also those who are forced to stay home and not work. I'm absolutely not underplaying that. But we are also seeing a huge amount of people coming together on social media, on Zoom, on Skype, on conference calls, who are being able to carry on with their work and actually being able to do that in a way that isn't damaging the environment.
Yeah, totally. And I want to take a quick step back from this. I want to get back to climate change in a minute, but you've done so much science communication. You've written articles, you've given so many talks, you've appeared on so many television programs. What in your mind has been, give us a little background on like what's been the most successful ways in which you've really cut through and communicated science to people and gotten people interested who might not have been interested to start with, and what hasn't worked as well in your opinion?
Sure, thank you. It's a really interesting question. So my sort of something that I live by, one of my favorite quotes is it's unclear exactly what the quote is, but it's something, it was supposedly Albert Einstein who said something like, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Or if you can't explain it in a one sentence, or if you can't explain it to a child, there's various versions of that quote. And I really believe in that. People often sort of say, oh, but, is this talk aimed at kids or is it aimed at adults? Or is this book or this article, who's it aimed at? And I'm like, well, actually, it shouldn't really matter, because the way that I see science communication is that everything should be explained in a way that a child can understand it. And everything should be explained, if possible, in a way that's very, very concise and very simple. Obviously, you can up technical language and things like that, depending on if you've got a more academic audience. I'm not being sort of flippant about that. But one of my other favorite quotes, which I always use when I train people in communication skills, is I'm so sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I simply didn't have time to write you a short one. So for me, the essence of science communication is finding the simplest and shortest possible way to explain something using the simplest language and the fewest words. And actually, that may seem from the outside like it's easy when you see someone doing it and doing it well, but actually that's the skill, and that's what takes a lot of time. And I've just spent many months working with other amazing climate scientists to write a hugely long document about the science of the climate and ecological emergency and everything that's going on the planet. And the next task is then to condense it down and then to condense it down and to end up with something really, really short and concise. So, and that's what takes the time, but I think that's what's most effective. And to that end, I think some of the most effective science communication that I've been involved with has actually been very mainstream, which was on a celebrity panel show on Sky, which is called Duck Quacks Don't Echo, which some people might have seen, which was sort of very sort of fun and light-hearted and flippant, and myself and two other science, not flippant in the sense that it's not real science, because it was, but it might have been seen as kind of just a bit of fun. But myself and the two other brilliant scientists, science communicators, who were experts on the panel of experts on that show, we spent a lot of time and a lot of energy kind of answering questions from celebrities and from the studio audience and about sort of weird, strange science facts. And we would kind of condense it down to kind of 30 seconds of a sort of pithy explanation. And people would go away and they'd remember it. And that was because we were able to kind of express it in a way that was simple language, that was fun, that was lighthearted, maybe put in a sort of a joke or something fun with it. And left people with kind of the real bare bones of what it was that we were trying to explain. So, my favorite is, did you know that you can block a tickle? And there's lots of sort of complicated science in there if you want to find it, but the bottom line is that our brain, in order to feel ticklish, our brain needs to feel surprised, because that's how we've evolved, partly to feel ticklish with surprising feelings on our skin in case it's some kind of nasty creature that might bite us or sting us or scratch it. So we feel ticklish and we flick it away and get rid of it. Then, of course, there's also social bonding that comes through being ticklish with a slightly separate type of tickle. But the basic science is that our brain needs to be surprised. If it's our own hands on our own skin, our brain can make a quick prediction about that, how that's going to feel. And in doing so, it blocks the tickly feelings so that we don't fall about laughing every time we touch our feet and put on our shoes and socks. So using that logic, we can simply, if someone is tickling you, all you need to do is put your hands on their hands whilst they're tickling you. Your brain will think it's your own hands. It will be able to predict how that's going to feel very, very quickly, and it will be able to block the tickly feelings. So there's lots of very complex science in there if you want to find it, but the bottom line is, if you can kind of condense it to just the the bare bones of the logic of the science, then people will get that. And I think that's where the skill and that's where the technique in science communication comes, even if it's a very complicated topic and very complex, is to kind of distill it down to the basics. And I really like, there's some research as well in terms of what it's actually used as giving good speeches, but I think it applies very well to science communication, is that it's really good if we can break our arguments down into sort of 3 areas. So the 3 areas in terms of giving great speeches are always said, I'm just bringing it up. So the areas are said to be logos, ethos, and pathos or pathos. So logos is the logical argument, if you put your hands on someone else's hands, this is why it will block the tickle, blah, blah, blah. This is what your brain's doing. Or in the case of, let's say, spreading of the pandemic right now, the logic is if you go outside and you don't have symptoms, it could take 14 days for you to show your symptoms. In that 14 days, you might think you're totally fine. During that time, you might walk around and breathe on or touch things that other people are touching. Those other people may then get that virus before you even know you've got it. They could then take it into themselves and they could go and infect someone, particularly someone who is vulnerable or over 70 or has an underlying health condition. So you've got your logical argument, but that on its own, which a lot of scientists think often that that's enough. And I think the role of science communication is to say, actually, we need more than that. So that is one part. The second part is the ethos, which is the trustworthiness based on the source, based on who are you to say this? Why do you have the authority to say this? So, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an expert in virus transmission, neither am I a climate scientist. But I have authority to some extent because I have a degree in molecular biology. I have a PhD in cancer research, which was microbiology. And also I've done a lot of reading in the last year. I've read every article and paper that I can find on the climate and ecological crisis. I've spoken to a lot of experts. So as a scientist, I know how to understand information and analyze primary sources and make sure that things are true that I'm saying. And also in the world of the pandemic right now, I've spent the last week kind of barely leaving my computer trying to get up to date on all the science and making sure that I know as far as possible what it is that we should be trusting. And I'm also, in terms of perceived as being an authority, I think being on the television helps, being on quiz shows, being on quite mainstream stuff. So it's about not just what information you're giving as an expert, but who you are and why people should trust you, and what your sources are and why people should trust those. And then the third part of the argument that often gets missed, again, by scientists or by anyone who's an expert, is that the pathos, the emotional side of the argument, the appeal to the emotions. So, what is actually going to happen if we don't, bring our carbon emissions down from this year down to by 50% by 2030, to net zero by 2050? What's actually going to happen to individuals? Are we going to be looking at food shortages? Well, probably yes. Are we going to be looking at spread of disease? Well, probably yes, because of heightened temperatures. Are we going to be looking at changes to our weather systems, more rain, more floods, more droughts? In European countries, certainly more floods, and that could lead to knock-on effects of yields of crops, to food shortages, and if we keep on going to civil unrest and to kind of very unstable communities. So it's really bringing that into the personal. And with COVID, with coronavirus, it's bringing it into, do you have someone in your life that is over 70? Do you have someone in your life that is vulnerable, that has an underlying health condition, that has challenges with asthma, with their lungs, with their immune system? And, really trying to persuade people to stay home and to self-isolate, to socially distance, based on the fact that, if people are walking around in the street, even if they don't have symptoms, it might be that if you walk around in the street, you could pick up the virus from them, you could then bring it home and transfer it to that relative of yours who you care deeply about and who you might unwittingly be passing on the disease to, the virus to. So it's about bringing in the personal, the emotional content. Totally. I think Greta Thunberg does this very, very well. For everything she says, she gives the logic. we have 8 years till we run out of our carbon budget if we want 66% chance of staying below 1.5, which is absolutely imperative. She gives that logical argument. She backs it by saying this is what the IPCC are recommending. This is what is advocated by the UN Secretary General, by heads of state, by really important and trustworthy people. And then she appeals to the emotions. She says, how dare you, why are you killing our children? Why are you making the lives of our children, our grandchildren unsafe? Do you have children? How can you let them grow up in this world? And she appeals to the emotion in that way.
And we've actually got an audience question that just came in that kind of deals with some of these things.
Great.
From Simon, tooting our own horn a bit here, but we've started working on a format that is simply and explicitly as possible correlates data on climate change and the impact of corona. I wonder what your opinion is here. A lot of people say that it's not the time to make people even more afraid by saying that the climate crisis will be so much more worse than this coronavirus. But our opinion is that if this isn't the time to give an understanding of how scary climate change is, then when is?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and it's such an important issue. And honestly, I don't know the answer. On the one hand, you're right. Everyone's really frightened right now. And the most important thing that I feel that I can be doing in this moment as a science communicator is trying to get people to stay at home and trying to get people to understand the importance of self-isolation, even if you're young and fit and healthy. In fact, particularly if you're young and fit and healthy, because you will be the vectors, the carriers who can transfer it to those who are more vulnerable. And that we're seeing young, fit and healthy people very, very sick in hospitals already with coronavirus. So it's not something that just impacts the elderly or the vulnerable. However, I do completely agree that, if we come back from this, when we come back from this, if we haven't in the meantime raised even more awareness about the climate and ecological crisis, then we're going to go back to business as usual. In fact, even more so, because there's, the fossil fuel companies are currently asking for billions of pounds to bail them out, to tide them over, whilst in the meantime of the pandemic. And this is the worst thing that could be happening. And yes, we are seeing that there are certainly many viruses, corona maybe not, that are being increased their transmission due to warmer climates, dengue fever and malaria, to name but a few, that because of higher temperatures throughout the year, they're being transmitted more effectively, because warmer climates aid transmission. There's conflicting evidence in terms of coronavirus itself, because there's some evidence that vitamin D can actually help to slow down and make people perhaps less able to contract coronavirus. Not that in any way should prevent people from needing to do absolute social isolation and distancing, but there is some suggestion that it might be in the summer months that we do see a slowing of coronavirus, but that's not to be mistaken for or mistakenly kind of correlated with, okay, well then climate change is good, because actually it's climate change itself that is leading to thawing of ice that might be releasing viruses that have been trapped for centuries, if not millennia. Climate change is also leading to loss of habitats, to animals moving around where they shouldn't be, to changes in our ecosystems that is leading to viruses and diseases traveling to parts of the world where they shouldn't be seen, and maybe new viruses and diseases occurring. So yeah, I think this is a great time for us to be really talking about the fact that climate change may well have been influential in this current epidemic, and that we should be absolutely using this opportunity as well to say that it's not just enough to be looking at this current pandemic, but that we need to be looking at how we come back from this in terms of making climate and ecological change an absolute priority. There's no doubt that right now we're seeing reduced emissions and less pollution, and it's wonderful. And we're seeing kind of birds starting to sing in areas where they've never been heard before. There was a beautiful video of Wuhan on BBC recently of hearing birds singing that is just totally unknown there, and it's wonderful. But that's not going to be enough. It's absolutely not going to be enough. Otherwise, we're just going to come back with a vengeance with fossil fuel emissions after this pandemic is hopefully over.
Yeah, totally. And I'm so sorry that we've run out of time, I think. But it's been so lovely to talk to you, and thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we're all gonna follow what happens next, and hopefully things get better. but hopefully some of us decide to not take planes in the future too.
Yeah, that would be great. That's a really important thing that we can all do to help.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much. And for those tuning in, I'll be back in a couple minutes with our next and final session.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here.
Okay. Bye.